Okay. All right, we're live.
Thanks, Jay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th annual Anti-Colonial Thanksgiving event hosted by the Rosa Luxemburg Club, the Communist Party of Canada Club in Ottawa. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us. We have some outstanding guest speakers for today. And I just want to acknowledge that this event, even though virtual, is taking place on unceded Algonquin territory. So that having been said, I will introduce you to our committee. And we'll start with Jay Watts, who is doing the technical all the way from Toronto. Welcome, Jay. The other members of the committee, myself, Larry Wasslin, I'm the organizer of the Rosa Luxemburg Club. We have Roman Mancini, also a member of the club, and William Milner. So these are the three hosts of this afternoon's event. And as we go through the event, you will meet Communist Party leader Liz Rowley. Welcome, Liz. William Redhawk Martinez, who will be the opening speaker. We'll give you a little bio about each of these speakers. And we have Yaroslava Avila and Brad Evoy. And like I said, we will give you a brief intro on each of these wonderful people. And we have a Normand Raymond, who is an Ojibwe singer-songwriter, who we are also very, very pleased to have with us this afternoon. So without any further delay, I will turn this over to, I'm not sure if it's William or Roman, but to introduce our first speaker.
Howdy, everybody. Like Larry said, we're very lucky and very pleased to have Normand Raymond joining us. Normand is a singer-songwriter who will be playing a few songs throughout the evening. In addition, Normand is a musician, a poet, a translator, and a member of the board of directors of Les Artistes pour la Paix du Québec, and a co-founding member of the Buffalo Hat Singers, a group of North American First Nations traditional powwow musicians. In addition, Normand is an anti-imperialist and social justice activist, and a longtime supporter of First Nations self-determination. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Normand, who's going to start us off with a song.
Okay. Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say that I'm not Ojibwe. I'm Métis. I have some ancestry of Anishinaabe, but I'm not Ojibwe. Just to clarify. Okay, the first song I'll be interpreting, it's an Ojibwe song. It's a Thunderbird song. It's a very old song. Yahweh, 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 Hey, na que no wenteco, Veneseo wenteco, New weha, 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 ya, hey, ha, ya, we, yo, hey, 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 yo, ya, we, yo, 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 hey, ha, ya, we, yo, 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 ya, hey, ha. hey, 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 yo, hey, hey, yo. En ave que no enteco, Venecio enteco, venio. Weha, 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 ya, hey, ha, ya, we, yo, hey, 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 yo. Yahweh, 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 hey, ha. Yahweh, 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 hey, ha. Hey, ha, ya, hey, ha, we, ya, hey, ha, we, ya, hey, ha. Hey, ha, we, ha, we, ha, ya, hey, ha, Yahweh, yo, hey, 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 yo, hey, hey, yo. En ave que no enteco, Venecio enteco, venio. Weha, 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 ya, hey, ha, ya, we, yo, hey, 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 yo. Miigwech.
Thank you so much. That was very good. That's a great start. I'm going to go now to William to introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. So our first speaker is William Redhawk Martinez. He's an elder of the San Pascal Band of Mission Indians of California. He's a federally recognized member of the Kumeyaay Sovereign Nation, and you may have to correct my pronunciation of that, I'm sorry. He has a degree in aerospace aerodynamics and was an aerospace engineer for 40 years before retiring in 2015. He's a member of the American Indian Movement and a member of a Native parliamentary group undertaking an initiative in the US to change the inaccurate name Native American Indian to just Native Person or First Native. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away, William.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I appreciate the invitation to the meeting. You know, this time of year is a interesting time for us because of the Thanksgiving holidays, which are not particularly well liked by the Native community in the U.S. You know, Canadian Thanksgiving has a certain meaning to it versus the U.S. Thanksgiving. Canadian Thanksgiving, you know, I understand is a celebration of harvest and the bountiful events that happen during the year, which this year I can't imagine there'd be a whole lot to be celebrating with what's been going on, but there are some things, I'm sure. It is interesting that Canadians' Thanksgiving Day happens to fall on Columbus Day in the U.S., which of course is not a well-liked holiday in the U.S. at all by the Native people because of the inaccuracies of what is being celebrated with as far as Columbus supposedly discovering North America, and that type of thought process continues even on today with, I mean, just yesterday, Donald Trump, you know, was concerned about the fact that there's a lot of people criticizing Columbus and destroying his historical value to the country as far as his accomplishments are concerned. So, you know, for Canada, I think it's a little bit more of a positive celebration. For the U.S., especially the Native people. You know, it was intended to celebrate the first dinner that was between the Pilgrims and the Native community in the eastern country. That first meeting is supposedly held about 95 Natives and around 50 or so Pilgrims. The interesting event after that is that out of the 95 Natives that attended that meeting or that celebration, only one survived because of the diseases that were brought on from the Pilgrims. So there was not a good beginning to the Native people as far as that first meeting was concerned. And that is actually Thanksgiving in the U.S. is actually considered a national day of mourning for the Native people in the U.S. now. It's also been identified as Indigenous Peoples Day in the U.S. I don't know if that was to help appease what the negativity that was being applied to it, but for our group, my tribe or my band in Southern California, we take it as a day that we're the first. It's the beginning of the genocide of the millions of Native people throughout the U.S. that were killed by the government and military actions, or by diseases or events such as the Trail of Tears March or whatever may have occurred. You know, it's estimated that 95 to 114 million Native people died as a result of U.S. government actions or diseases that were brought on by the colonials or the settlers that spread across the country. You take that number and put it in context to any type of a war or the Holocaust or whatever, and that's quite a large number of people that were systematically wiped off wiped out of the country. So it's not a good time of the year for us. We enter into, like I said, a time of mourning. We're actually trying to make connection with Canada and that become a larger event as far as recognizing the true nature of what the holidays are about. And it's also, you know, part of as far as we feel, as part of the continued colonialism of the U.S. government, where they continue to try to keep natives or minority groups down as far as being able to grow and prosper and become a larger voice in the community. An example of that is that my tribe has over 900 living descendants right now. But because in order to be recognized as a native or an American Indian, you have to be enrolled, only 120 of our members are recognized. So out of the 900 people, we only have 128 recognized members. That's a problem that we're trying to address. My aim is trying to address it. We're trying to address it through the two Native Congresswomen now that who are in place, Deborah Howland and Sharice Davies or David, and hopefully we can get something done. But for right now, it's going to be a long process. And you had mentioned earlier that we also have an initiative going on as far as trying to change the name, get the name American Indian changed. I mean, you know, America was named after the country was taken away from the indigenous peoples, and so we're really not Americans. Also, we're certainly not Indians because none of us I'm aware of are from India, and we can thank Mr. Columbus for that. But so that's another initiative we're trying to take. But in the meantime, you know, we do our due diligence. We're paying close attention to the political events going on in the U.S. right now. Look with great interest to see the type of messages that are coming out of there. Don't expect a whole lot of change right away, but we're getting our younger people more involved to try and make sure that change will occur. As far as myself is concerned, I mean, I am retired. I had a long career in the aerospace industry, which I'm thankful for. But I've now turned to artwork. I mean, you can see kind of over my shoulder some of the artwork in the background, and my artwork. I have been told that my artwork is a little bit intimidating because there's not a lot of smiles involved with it. There's not a lot of happiness involved with it, but unfortunately, that's the way it is right now. I'm doing a rather lengthy project for the missing Indigenous women effort. I have a series of 4 drawings I'm doing right now where I've been working on them for about 3 months now, and I have one more to finish, and it's going to be presented to an art gallery in Wakefield, and that's where it'll be shown for the first time. So hopefully that'll help bring some attention to the missing Indigenous effort. And it's been a difficult process for me because it's very emotional. I've actually started over 5 times, and so this is my 5th effort. I'm finally happy with what I'm doing. But with that said, I'm happy there are groups like the Communist Party and others that are looking at governments and recognizing what real issues there are with the governments. I think this pandemic that's happened has, without intending to on its part, shown a lot of the shortfalls of current democracies or governments that are supposedly democracies, and how they really don't pay attention to the people and help the people, and the embarrassment of the long-term care facilities. I mean, it certainly is a large indication of how government, I think, just lost touch with people. They just don't have the ability to recognize or even be associated with the working person, the working class people, the people who are out there busting their butts on a daily basis. They're just too far removed from that, and it's unfortunate it takes something like this pandemic to maybe bring that to attention. But if that's the case, then that's the case, and hopefully things will. People stay safe. They can survive the economic downturn of this, and I know for as far as the Indigenous people in the U.S., it's been a hardship, as it has been in Canada. Healthcare for the Indigenous people is always a big issue, and I know that there's been some real struggles there. So I hope there's voices out there that are they're going to be speaking and louder and pointing out the shortcomings of what's happened and what's continuing to happen. I think about the Genesis song "Land of Confusion," and I don't know, some of you may not be old enough to know that song, but if you get a chance to listen to it, because it certainly is apropos to what's going on right now. And so, with that said, I mean, I really appreciate the time to talk a little bit and talk about Thanksgiving, and hopefully, over the next year or so, I'll have more opportunity as I move out with my artwork into the public to get voice more of an opinion. So with that said, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, William. That was great. I always call you Bill, so I'll say Bill.
No problem with that at all.
So that's great. I just want to mention that Bill gave a very interesting educational to the Rosa Luxemburg Club. I think it's about 6 or 8 months ago now. And we really appreciated that. And I also really appreciate how Bill linked understanding the colonial past to struggling against the colonial present. And with that, I'm going to introduce to you Brad Evoy, and I'm sure that Brad will be able to make that link as well. So Brad is a disabled Mi'kmaq organizer and writer, former executive of the Canadian Union of Public Employees District Council in Ottawa, and a former member of the International Workers of the World General Defense Committee. And we have had many long years, wonderful years of working with Brad. He's a true comrade. And turning it over to you, Brad.
Miigwech, thank you, Larry. I really appreciate that. It's always wonderful to spend time with all of you folks, especially on a day like today where we're talking about colonial Thanksgiving and the broader perspectives of resistance that come with that from our communities. And I guess I just wanted to start with a bit of the way that I frame this kind of stuff and the thoughts that come to my mind with the idea of Thanksgiving. And I think with Thanksgiving here in these territories, I'm currently sitting on Algonquin territory here in Gatineau, and the process of Thanksgiving and these particular holidays, back before it became a set holiday, of course, it was a holiday of Thanksgiving and for the harvest, or sometimes for at the end of a war, or if the local prince got over a flu or what have you, called by the colonial monarchy. So these would be dictates from the king or queen given at the time. And, you know, everyone is supposed to, you know, put down their plowshares and celebrate, you know, whatever the monarch really feels we should. And this really brings to mind and centers the inherently colonial relationship with this day for all of our peoples, in terms of the expectation that the Canadian state has that, you know, peoples from every nation and every distinction across these territories, from east to west, to north to south, and every sea and lake and river in between, that we submit ourselves to the crown. And I think that that is something that we have to keep in mind in this context, is that ultimately the Canadian state is built on that submission and subjugation of our peoples to a crown that is across an ocean, and to the peoples that uphold that system of oligarchy, of capitalism, and of genocide that reigns over our people and has reigned over our people from the moment Europeans stepped on these shores. What I think about now in terms of tying things to the present, I think, as Larry mentioned, you know, the current situation here on these territories, as I think folks may be aware, is very dire for our people. Be it folks on the West Coast defending against the encroach of pipelines and defending their territories from resource extraction, to the attacks closer to my home territories in Mi'kma'ki by you know, settler fishermen who are burning traps and attacking the fishing rights of Mi'kmaq people across our territories, asserting themselves as superior in a very white supremacist sort of way. And, you know, even close to here, across Algonquin territory, communities are fighting for their land rights against development, but also for their hunting rights here all around this territory. And in urban centers and beyond, the continual encroach of the colonial RCMP and other police forces puts our people constantly at the edge and threat of violence. It's something that if you work in our service sectors or in areas where you you know, work on the grassroots side of things, you see this every day, where people have stories of the violence exacted upon them by the Canadian state. Ultimately, a lot of the institutions that make up Canada, so-called Canada, are founded on the blood and bones of our peoples. Be it the RCMP, be it the child welfare system, be it a lot of the education system. All of these pieces rest on colonial dispossession and violence all across this so-called country. And so it's really important, I think, for us to center resistance to those mechanisms deeply and fundamentally in everything that we do on a day like today. While we can give thanks for the food and the things that are on our tables, we also have to keep in mind fundamentally that all of that comes from the dispossession of our peoples and the labor of those who have been oppressed all across this so-called nation. And that ties into, of course, struggles around migrant justice, which in many cases is just, again, the dispossession of other Indigenous peoples from their lands to work the lands here in so-called Canada. And all of these things are intensified further when we look at the current coronavirus pandemic, where protections for those displaced Indigenous peoples that work the lands here are further subjected to violence and further subjected to restriction, and to the continual violence against our own people that can be easily papered over as we are distracted by other current things that are happening here with the pandemic and with our inability necessarily to gather and resist in person in certain settings. But it's important now more than ever to keep that in mind and to build that resistance as part of what we do. You know, when I think about futures, and I like to think about futures beyond here and beyond the current time as much as I can when I think about days like today, I think about the idea of what I would want these territories to be and to look like at a time when these structures have gone and passed away. And I think about a world where our peoples can govern themselves with our own structures in a way that is fully free from capitalism. Ultimately, it is capitalism that is at the core of much of our repression and is interlinked and intertwined and intersects with all pieces of it. And as such, destroying that system of economic violence is paramount to any future that we'd want to build together. I think about systems where, you know, we operate and make decisions in ways that are collective, that are based in our own traditions, cosmologies, and ideas, and free from the fundamentally alienating systems that drive this so-called country. Where instead of valuing economy over people's lives during a deadly pandemic, that we actually are able to focus on the lived relations with the land and with other people. Ultimately, to me, you know, I think that if you are bothered by everything that we are experiencing under capitalism, if you're bothered by how things have been during this pandemic and the violence that people have suffered in this way, if you're tired of hearing in the news of Indigenous and Black and other racialized folks being subjected to violence by the state, ultimately what we need to fight for is to fight for Indigenous sovereignty. Our peoples and our ways of knowing are completely alienated from this reality. I strongly believe that in a world where our people's sovereignty is fully recognized and fully enacted, where the Canadian state has truly withered away, that we would have the ability to envision new and different futures that would not be capitalist, that would not engage in the monopoly of violence that our current state exhibits, and that we would have the freedom to value those relations with the land and with each other over that of profit, and in all cases, especially cases lately, devaluing the life of people, you know, all across this so-called nation. And I think I'm going to leave it there, friends. But I really deeply appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you today. And I just want to further state before I go, I think it's really important for everyone who's listening to this today, if you have a moment, to take the time to engage with the current ongoing struggles here on this land in terms of the defense of hunting rights for Algonquin folks, for the defense of my own peoples and our fishing rights on the East Coast, and the extractive industries that are tearing up things on the West Coast. Please, please take the time to learn more beyond than what I can say in this time about the Haudenosaunee struggles happening with 1492 Land Back Lane and the repression of the police state that goes along in those areas. And if you are in a union, or if you are in a progressive body that has any affiliation with the colonial police or the colonial security forces, end those relationships. If you truly believe in a sovereign idea for Indigenous people, you have to end those relationships and deconstruct those institutions. They were built from the very start on the deaths and on the blood of our peoples and on other oppressed peoples throughout this country. And I would hope that my message today to all of you would be that together we can see those futures that I've spoken about, truly anti-colonial, decolonial futures where our people are sovereign. But each of those steps are necessary and will see us to those futures. So Miigwech Walalan, thank you to all of you who invited me to speak today, and I'll pass it back to Larry.
Thank you very much, Brad. Thank you very much. Connecting the colonial system of exploitation with the capitalist system of exploitation is very timely. I would like now to introduce Yaroslava. Yaroslava is a Mapuche organizer and researcher with the Women's Coordinating Committee for a free, whoops, hang on a second. For a free Wallmapu, an indigenous rights organization advocating the freedom of Mapuche political prisoners in Chile and Mapuche self-determination. She is currently a doctoral student at the Department of Politics of York University and focuses on surveillance security regimes throughout the Americas and the criminalization of far-left movements, Indigenous peoples, and other marginalized people. So this will, Yaroslava helps us expand from our focus on, as Brad put it, so-called Canada, and as Bill noted, the American designation for those First Nations peoples and their land, and now to the whole hemisphere. So Yaroslava, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mari Pulamien. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this event. My name is Yaroslava. I'm from the Women's Coordinating Committee for Free Wallmapu. We're a Mapuche organization that advocates for the freedom of Mapuche political prisoners, as Larry was mentioning. And so I'm gonna talk a little bit broadly about the broader history of anti-colonial indigenous struggles on Turtle Island and North America, Turtle Island and Avila, which we call North America and South America, and the trajectories, the historical trajectories that they've actually led towards in the last few years. So again, thank you for sharing with these wonderful speakers. So the last 30 years has been a really tumultuous time and turning point for Indigenous peoples and struggles coming to a head now in the reclamation of Indigenous land and Indigenous struggles that we're seeing all across the Americas, both here on Turtle Island and in Avila. This year, for example, marks the 30th anniversary of the Siege of Kanazadake, better known as the Oka Crisis, beginning on July 11th, 1990, in which the Haudenosaunee Mohawk peoples rose up in resistance to the proposed expansion of a golf course in the nearby town of Oka, land which was stolen from the Haudenosaunee peoples in many, many years prior. In solidarity with the Mohawk community of Kanazadake, the nearby community of Kanawake decided to also expropriate and occupy the Mercier Bridge that leads the community to the city of Montreal, These sieges, one in Kanazadake and the other in Kanawake, led to a 78-day siege where Mohawk peoples from both communities confronted police and military encroachment until September 26th of 1990, when the last remaining warriors decided to disengage. And so following the Oka crisis, we have a series of events centering on Indigenous resistance that has taken place throughout the entire continent. We have the Zapatista uprising in 1994, the siege of Gustafson Lake in 1995, the Ipperwash crisis also in 1995, and we also have the reorganization of Mapuche communities and land defenders within the territory known as Chile into the Coordinadora Arauco Mayeco, the Arauco Mayeco Coordinating Committee, or CAM as they're broadly known, in 1998. And so these events are extremely important in the history and development of Indigenous struggles for two main reasons. One is that these events break down the myths of the capitalist state and the capitalist nation state in particular, traditionally used as a vehicle to subjugate Indigenous peoples under colonial, capitalist, and imperial rule. So by centering Indigenous peoples as not only the original and rightful title holders of the land, we not only defy the myths of capitalist state sovereignty, we also position ourselves as the main actors in our own liberation, willing to take back our own history in our own hands. And this leads to the second point. The second major point is that these events also break down the myth and the neoliberal narrative to the so-called end of history, which after the fall of the Berlin Wall attempts to consolidate world order under a capitalist order, which increasingly ravages Indigenous territories through extractivism. And so at a time in which anti-colonial movements of all kinds, including insurrectionary and revolutionary movements across the world, were being forced into submission, Indigenous-led movements like that of the Oka crisis in 1990, and later the formation of the CAM in Mapuche territory in 1998, meant that this resistance was not only possible, but also a viable option for liberation. And this has led to a variety of different approaches to land reclamation and Indigenous struggles that we see today. Within this process, the Mapuche nation, the nation that I am from, has particularly been at the forefront of anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggles for the last 30 years, while also being deeply criminalized and struggling within a territory where 70% of the rural lands and 80% of the waters are privatized as a legacy of the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And this legacy continues throughout the transition to democracy, where Indigenous peoples were increasingly encroached on by capitalist interests on their traditional territory. And so the active land reclamations against landed estate owners have brought criminalization and increasing state repression in a variety of forms. The brutal murders of at least 15 non-violent Mapuche land defenders under various governments, including Lagos, Bachelet, and Piñera, including 17-year-old Alex Lamoon in 2002, 22-year-old Matias Cachileo in 2008, and Camilo Cachiyanca under Piñera in 2018, as well as the implementation of anti-terrorism legislation that was first implemented in 2001 under Ricardo Lagos, persecuting, that then led to the persecution of dozens, if not hundreds, of Mapuche land defenders over the last 20 years. And so this has also resulted in countless hunger strikes by Mapuche political prisoners, the longest of which ended up most recently this September 9th of this year, amounting to 123 days on hunger strike, so that Indigenous political prisoners could have access to be able to have access to their communities. And so despite this repression, this ongoing criminalization by the Chilean state in particular, as well as other states throughout the Americas, have only strengthened the resolve of Indigenous communities, Mapuche communities, and their struggle for liberation, which are now part of a wider social revolt against neoliberalism that you can see that's happening across the continent. And so the lessons that we can derive both from the Oka crisis and ongoing indigenous struggles, such as the Mapuche struggle for liberation, is that any transformation of society from this point forward, be they socialist or otherwise, must not only include indigenous struggles for liberation, but also have indigenous peoples be able to define their own forms of liberation within broader struggles. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with that thought and just a memory and solidarity to all of the frontline indigenous peoples that are fighting back for their land across the continent, who are in solidarity with other anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles throughout the continent. We're seeing our day rise to the occasion. We're seeing the struggles, for example, in Wallmapu and in Chile, as well as in around like Turtle Island, come to a halt, and to put an end to this idea of the so-called end of history, so that we can take our own struggles and use this as a way of being able, as a tool to be able to liberate our own peoples from the shackles of capitalism and colonialism. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and I'll pass it back to Larry.
All right, thank you so much, Yaroslava. Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Bill. Those were wonderful words, driving the nail home. I just would like to note that there is a major battle now going on in Bolivia, where the white supremacist fascist takeover and removal of the first Aboriginal president in Turtle Island throughout the whole North and South is driven by this white supremacy, by this colonial imperialist logic, and the massive mobilization of First Nations people in Bolivia is an example. Also, for example, in Ecuador, there is massive struggles there by First Nations peoples. And yes, thank you to all of our First Nations speakers for linking all of these struggles in this ongoing battle against past colonial injustice and present colonial injustice. I'm going to turn it over now to Roman.
Yeah, so at this time, we just want to reintroduce and turn the digital stage back over to Normand, who's going to play another song for us.
Yeah, this time I'm going to sing a song of Buffy St. Mary. So it's going to be with the guitar. It's a song that talks about anti-colonialism. The title, Now That the Buffalo's Gone. Probably a lot of people know this song. So this is it. I'll turn up just the sound, the speakers. It doesn't make feedbacks. Sorry. Remember the times that you have held your head high, told all your friends of your Indian claim. Proud good lady and proud good man, some great grandfather from Indian blood came, and you feel in your heart for these ones. Oh, it's written in books and in songs that we've been mistreated and wrong. Well, over and over I hear the same words. from you, good lady, and you, good man. Well, listen to me if you care where we stand, and you feel you're a part of these ones. When the war between nations is lost, the loser we know pays the cost. But even when Germany fell to your hands, consider, dear lady, consider, dear man, you left them their pride and you left them their land. And what have you done to these ones? Has the change come about, my dear man? Or are you still taking our land? Treaty forever your senators sign. They do, dear lady, they do, dear man. And the treaties are broken again and again. And what will you do for these ones? Oh, it's all in the past, you can say. But it's still going on here today. The governments now want the Ojibwe land, that of the Inuit and Wet'suwet'en. It's here and it's now, you must tell her, dear man, now that the buffalo's gone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Normand. A very inspiring song. Very inspiring. Very
I took the liberty to change a little the lyric at the end to put the Wet'suwet'en.
Yes, yes. A very, very nice touch. Very nice
And it was
touch.
the last version of Buffy St. Mary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we are going to hear. We're going to hear from Normand again, not too far from now. So right now, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today's event. Many of you already know Comrade Liz Rowley, the leader of the Communist Party of Canada. She has been in the struggle for a few years now, shall we say? She was also elected a school trustee in the, I believe it was East Toronto School Board at the time. I can't remember the exact name there. But Liz is going to speak to us today about some very important issues that are currently facing all of us. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Larry. And good afternoon, everybody. And as others have said, very inspiring speakers preceded me. So I hope to add something to the conversation here as well. Like William, I noted that this Thanksgiving in Canada on Monday is the same Columbus Day in the United States. And it's very fitting if we are having an anti-colonial Thanksgiving to remember Columbus and who he was and what he represented. Because of course, as William noted, he was on his way to China on behalf of Spain, of the Spanish government, expecting to be able to engage in trade and exploit the people in China and to the benefit of the Spanish crown. And instead, he ended up in Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And that Hispaniola was actually the first colony of Spain and the first colony of any country in North America, the first of many, and the first place where Europeans took slaves as well. So this is the history of Christopher Columbus, and this is the history that should never be celebrated, should be repudiated, should be exposed for what it is. And we here in Canada, although as William said, we celebrate the harvest, but we also celebrate this idea that somehow North America and Canada were discovered by Europeans in search of a way through the Northwest Passage and for trade, etc. And this is in fact colonialism, a product of mercantile capitalism, which was based on mainly on trade, and initially in Canada it had to do with trade in furs and in fish, in timber, etc., and which developed fairly quickly into the beginnings of, well, settlement of Canada and North America, and the beginnings of the development of a capitalist class that was located in Canada. By 1763, Britain had succeeded in defeating France in North America and in the Atlantic provinces. And we saw the departure of wealthy French representatives of colonialism in Quebec and in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And who was left were the poor farmers and the people who had no wealth, no ability to return to France, and who became the exploited and oppressed French-Canadian nation, which we now know of as Quebec. And in the Atlantic, of course, it's the Acadian people who were expelled by the British and who fled from Nova Scotia largely to New Brunswick, where majority now live, but also some of them went to Louisiana. And so William will in particular will know about the Louisiana French and some of the culture and language which remains there. By 1867 and Confederation in Canada, we had industrial expansion across Canada by capitalism, developing capitalism. At that time, Canada was a dependent British colony, but by the beginning of the 20th century, Canadian capitalism was much more dependent on US and much more capital and US capitalism, and much more integrated with US capitalism than it was with British capitalism. This is some of the history of colonialism in Canada. And shortly after that, by the Second World War, we had developed in Canada state monopoly capitalism. And today, Canada is a fully fledged imperialist country. Well, in the wake of these Canada's colonial history, we have 500 years of genocide of the Indigenous peoples. And it's quite remarkable, although it's explicable, that the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, which stated very clearly that Canada has had a policy of genocide throughout this period and continues to have such a policy, that this was a matter of debate, when all of history flies in the face of that this is even a question, given what has happened, the history of the first arrival of Europeans in Canada, with the destruction, the complete obliteration of the Beothuk people in Newfoundland, where there are no Indigenous people who were Indigenous to Newfoundland left. The diseases that were deliberately spread amongst Indigenous peoples. Sorry. The treaties that were broken, the land that was stolen, residential schools, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And of course, the continuing death rates of Indigenous people who die at much younger ages than the general population, the high rate of infant mortality, the high suicide rates amongst Indigenous youth, the terrible conditions on reserves due to the fact that the federal government has refused to recognize the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples, provide them with the funds necessary to have clean water, for example, and not only to have clean water, but to have the infrastructure to be able to produce clean water on a permanent basis, sewage systems, housing that is not full of mold and falling apart because the federal government put up the cheapest possible housing, and so forth. And not least, and most recently in the news in Canada, the ongoing efforts of the federal government to refuse to provide equal funding for Indigenous children's health, education, and social services, although 3 times they have been ordered to pay the difference in funding to Indigenous peoples. In each case, each of these 3 times, the federal government has chosen instead to appeal the decisions of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunals and fight this decision. And this has affected 165,000 Indigenous children in Canada, and the dollar value of the difference that in the funding is $2 billion. So this is the reality of genocide. And it is not only historical, it continues today. And it's also evident in the rates of incarceration, for example, and addiction rates and poor health outcomes and so on. Well, I think probably everyone who's listening to this call, to this gathering is pretty familiar with these conditions. A little word about Quebec, because there are some similarities here, which I want to come back to in a moment. Quebec, while it was the people of Quebec who, as I've said, were the people who were not the rich people who all left when France was defeated by the British, but these are the poor farmers, the poor working stiffs who had no choice but to stay and try to survive under the English occupation of the new colonial power. Were not the victims of genocide, but they were certainly the victims of continuous efforts that forced assimilation. And we can see that in the attacks on language, French language and culture that have been ongoing from the time of defeat in 1763 right up into the present. And today, the French language and culture continue to be under attack, some of it by various laws, but also because of the influence, for example, of US mass culture, which also impacts in English-speaking Canada and the rest of Canada. The biggest question, of course, for both Quebecers, Francophones living in Quebec, and Indigenous people is the fact that they are nations and that they have the right to self-determination by virtue of the fact that they are nations. But this is a right which has been denied to them consistently, historically, and continues to be denied to them today. And if you remember, the first budget that the Trudeau government brought in after their election in 2015 was a budget which promised to a new relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada, plus tons of money which they promised to deliver. None of, or I shouldn't say none of which, but very little of which was actually ever delivered, but it sure made front page news and made the government look pretty good across the country to people who thought these were important promises. But in fact, the Canadian government has not delivered on their promises of a new relationship with Indigenous peoples. In fact, the situation is not much different than it was under the Harper government and under Liberal and Conservative governments prior to that. And we can see that in the big struggles that are underway today, whether it's over resource development, and the Site C Dam, for example. The struggle against Coastal GasLink in British Columbia, the courageous struggle of the Wet'suwet'en people, or whether it's the Muskrat Falls Dam in Newfoundland, or the Haudenosaunee and the land defenders in Ontario, or as one of the other speakers spoke about a few minutes ago, the struggle of the Mi'kmaq people and the fishery for the rights that have been granted to them, both by treaty rights that they have, but also as a result of the Donald Marshall decision more than 20 years ago now. But they still struggle for their rights. The Acadian people in Nova, at this point, most of them in New Brunswick, some of them in other parts of the country, have been under attack for some time now by very far right-wing political parties in New Brunswick, People's Party so-called. So think about Donald Trump in the conditions of New Brunswick. A party that wants to take away the bilingual status that it's the only province, New Brunswick is the only province in Canada which has a bilingual policy, official bilingualism, and this is a reference to the rights of the large Francophone population in New Brunswick, the Acadian population in New Brunswick. And they're trying to take away these rights, which includes, of course, the right to education, the right to services, and so forth. So everywhere, these democratic rights are under attack. These are, this is I guess we can say that this is the consequence of how Canada was founded. That Canada's initial founding was not the fairy tale that our kids learn in school about how, it was all nice and we all came together and we formed Canada, blah, blah, blah. Actually, Canada was created at the point of a gun, first by the genocide against Indigenous people, and then by the crushing of the people of Quebec and the Acadian people in the Maritimes. And this domination of English-speaking Canada, and in the first place, corporations and finance capital that operates in English-speaking Canada primarily, is the reason. But in fact, Canada is not just, it is one country at present, but it's comprised of many nations. We're a multinational state. And the obvious ones are the Indigenous peoples, who are multiple nations amongst them, and the people of Quebec and the Acadians, all of whom have the right under the United Nations Charter to self-determination, which includes the right to secession or to self-government if they so choose. And these are rights that have been denied since the founding of Canada. Hence the famous book, Unequal Union, which describes the fundamental character of Canada and the fact that this is the basis of the crisis, and that until that is resolved, the national question is going to keep boiling up, whether it has to do with the people in Quebec and their right to self-determination, or whether it has to do with Indigenous peoples and their right to self-determination. We in the Communist Party advocate a democratic solution to the crisis, and that solution involves a new Canadian Constitution that would guarantee the rights of each nation, including the English-speaking majority, or sometimes known as the rest of Canada. Each would have the right to be a part of the Canadian Federation or Canadian Federation, or would have the right to leave. And each would be, and this new unity would be a voluntary unity. And so very often people accuse us, they say, oh, you communists, you're in favor of destroying the country, of breaking up the country. But you know, that's not the case at all. It's very much like the right to divorce, because we advocate the right to divorce, which everybody in Canada, virtually everybody in Canada now accepts as, of course, everyone has the right to divorce, but it doesn't mean we are advocating that everybody should get divorced. It means we are advocating that everyone has the right to leave if they find out that the partnership they have, that they're participating in a marriage situation, it doesn't work anymore, then they have the right to leave. And this is the basis for equality of nations in Canada. And it's the guarantee that the unity will be a democratic one of those participants who decide they want to stay. So this is a pretty fundamental issue in Canada. Not every state or country is a multinational state or country, but Canada is. And until this is recognized and until there is a democratic solution, there is going to continue to be resistance and anger and mobilizations against the federal government, which tries to impose its will on the nations and peoples of Canada. Well, other speakers have spoken about some of the big issues that have risen as a result of these things. The fight, for example, in Quebec against the Clarity Act, against the War Measures Act when it was imposed 50 years ago in 1970. And Quebec was actually occupied by the Canadian military. Almost 500 people were arrested without warrant, without charge, and held incommunicado for days, sometimes weeks. And what was claimed by the government of the day, Pierre Trudeau, as a insurrection, apprehended insurrection. Of course, that wasn't the case at all, but that was the excuse used. And the people now in Quebec who are facing now instead the Clarity Act, which prohibits them from making a decision about their future that isn't first okayed by the government of Canada, which is of course capitalist government, which has no intention, as has been made very clear, of allowing the right of self-determination to the people of Quebec. So likewise, Indigenous peoples who are have been told that the government of Canada wants a new relationship with them, but are still trying to get a just settlement of Indigenous land claims, are still fighting for their inherent rights, are still fighting to for justice for their children, for equal funding for their children, for basic necessities that they have a right to, are still fighting against the corporate intrusions on their lands, and are still fighting against the racism which permeates Canadian society. So these are all issues that are going to continue to bubble until they are addressed. And we have some ideas which we have advocated in terms of what are some short-term solutions. The police killings of Indigenous people that we all know about, which happen here just as they happen in the United States, and are as ugly here as they are in the United States, and as urgent as well. And we have called for defunding the police, by which we mean that funds should be used for social housing, for social services, for youth, for job creation, and not for policing. We have called for disarming most police units, not everyone, but almost all of them. Why should police be walking through neighborhoods armed to the teeth? There is no need for that. And that is simply to intimidate and frighten people and it's the use of force. We also want to see the demilitarization of police. Why should police have tanks and water cannon and so forth? They have them in order to attack protesters, people who are resisting. We also want to see the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women implemented, not just talked about, but implemented. And there are many of them. It would make a big difference in terms of the living conditions and the relationships of Indigenous people to others in this country. We want to see strict civilian controls over police. And people say, well, we have those. What is the point? Well, I would argue that we don't have those. We have a form. We have some committees, so lots and lots of committees that have been struck all over the province, all over the country, but none of them have any power to really make a difference in terms of how the police will operate or how they won't, what their budgets will be, whether police can be compelled to be accountable and be answerable for the crimes that they commit. And as we all know, they commit many crimes. So we need to have those civilian control bodies need to have the powers to be able to compel the police to make the changes that need to be made. We want to see well, I can say that what we are seeing is a massive resistance across the country, starting with as a result of the murder of George Floyd, and that's when it really opened up about the extent of police wrongdoing, not only in the United States, but in Canada. And the protests, of course, took place right across Canada or across North America. There were demonstrations on 6 continents, and they're continuing today. So we think these are very important protests, and we think that it is important for all progressive people to try to work together to build these protests, to take on issues in addition to policing, to the questions of unemployment, for example, the question of misogyny, to anti-Muslim racism, to anti-LGBTQ, that this is an important democratic struggle. That if the labor movement were to get involved in this struggle, to be able to build it, to deal with the big issues that affect a majority of working people in Canada, this would be very important. This is the kind of people's coalition that we are calling for to be built. And this requires people in action. And we can see that not only the Black community, but many of the allies of the Black community are also in action. Indigenous peoples are in action. The environmental movement is in action. We need to, it has all of the possibilities for building something that could really lead to really fundamental changes in Canada, provided we can find the ways to pull these forces all together around a set of demands such as the People's Recovery Plan, which we advocate. And if you're interested, you can see it on our website. But it deals with all of these questions, including the question of incomes and jobs, the health crisis, and so forth. So I think I've spoken for quite a long time here. So I want to stop. I think there's time for questions here. Let me just say in conclusion that we say that capitalism is the virus and socialism is the cure. And really, at the end of the day, these problems, most of these really big problems in Canada will be solved under socialism, can be solved under socialism, although the national question is a dynamic question. It's always changing. The conditions are always changing, but the fight for equality will never change, and the fight for justice will never change. But this is the real solution to the problems that we're facing today. And in the meantime, what we need to do is to build up that unity and struggle that can bring us towards more fundamental change. We know that people are more interested in socialism now than they have been for many years. And the reason is pretty obvious. Capitalism has brought us this pandemic, the crisis that we are in. Not that it has been created by capitalism, but the conditions that we're facing as a result of the pandemic have certainly been brought to us by the inadequate response of capitalist governments, including in Canada, to the pandemic. And a lot of people have died and become ill as a result of it. So this is what is compelling people to really to decide that capitalism is working. It's working for some. It's working for the 1%. They're doing pretty good. It's working for the big corporations. They're doing very well. But the majority of people are not doing well at all. And this is the basis for unity, finding our common ground and pulling our efforts together for a common struggle. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz Rowley. Really appreciate those words. I just want to underline, for example, the most recent death of a First Nations woman and the reaction to that death. Joyce Echaquan, a Atikamekwe woman from Quebec who lay dying while being subjected to racist slurs recently in Quebec, and large mobilizations in Quebec against this, structural and pervasive racism that we must struggle against. So that is, that's the latest of who knows how many attacks that people have, First Nations people have undergone, and as Liz pointed out, throughout the prison system, throughout education system, and across the board, the struggle is ongoing. So now is the time for me to make a very important pitch to all of our listeners. There are at least 28 people currently listening in on YouTube. And the anti-colonial event that we hold each year is in part, an event to raise money for the work that we are doing at the Rosa Luxemburg Club and the Communist Party of Canada. And we're just asking people to make a donation as small as you have to, as large as you can, to help us in this struggle, the democratic struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, the anti-imperialist struggle. So if you can, either send a check to care of the Communist Party, 290A Danforth Avenue in Toronto, or reach out to me and I'll give you another address. We do have a very competent treasurer here in Ottawa as well. You could send the check there as well. So again, this is part of our overall struggle to advance the democratic struggle, the struggle against the exploitative capitalist system, imperialist war, environmental destruction, and the important work being done both at the local level and significantly across the country by the Communist Party of Canada. So be as generous as possible. Please let us know if you can help out. That would be wonderful. I also want to make a quick note here that tomorrow, Alba Ottawa will be holding a webinar on Bolivia. I put it into the chat amongst the Zoom group here, and I hope that our technical expert can share it with our YouTube members. And I'm getting a thumbs up from our technical expert. So I encourage you to attend that meeting tomorrow at 1 o'clock, I believe. Or maybe it's at 2. I think it's at 2 o'clock. Anyway, check out the link. It'll tell you for sure. Now, I would like to open up the all of our guests, and including our guest speakers, if they have a question, to submit any questions you may have, perhaps point it to the person you wish to answer your question. Jay is on for the YouTubers to pass it on to us. So I'll wait to hear from our questioners. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't have anything yet, but we'll give people a little bit before they hear, because there's a bit of a delay between when we speak and when it goes out to YouTube. So
thank you, Jay. Thank you very much.
Larry, I do have a comment about sovereignty.
About what?
Sovereignty, the sovereign, the nations, and getting.
Yes, please go ahead, Bill.
Giving or granted sovereignty. You know, we have the First Nations in the U.S. have been granted sovereignty by the U.S. government. However, it came with strings attached, and that's always very important when you're dealing with a capitalist society or the type of government that the U.S. is. We have the right to have our own governments, and we have our own constitution. In particular, our tribe has its own constitution, but it has to be modeled after the U.S. Constitution, and our judicial system has to be parliamentary in order for it to be approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So on one hand, they give you, okay, you're a sovereign nation. On the other hand, they say, as long as you follow our rules. So when this type of effort is taking place, it has to be very clear that it's going to be under the rules of the Indigenous people and not be governed by anyone else. And so we're fighting that battle right now as well. As far as we can't be, and it's the old saying, you can't be a little bit pregnant. We are either a sovereign group or we're not. Which one are we? So that's something to think about when the groups are fighting the battle as far as trying to get their sovereignty is concerned.
Thank you for sharing that, Bill. That's a very important distinction. And I think it's one of the crucial distinguishing concepts that the Communist Party puts forward in terms of Canada, which is that First Nations people have the right to self-determination up to and including separation. That's critical. You know, this is something the First Nations people themselves have to decide. It's not something that the Canadian colonial imperialist state can impose. This has to come from the people, the First Nations peoples. So thank you for bringing that up. And it's an important distinction between what the capitalists are proposing and what we are proposing. Jay, any questions? Liz, you wanted to say something. Go ahead, please.
Quickly, if I just further to what William was saying, I think the situation here is not a lot different, and I just point to the whole issue of the pipelines in Canada, which I'm sure, William, you're aware is a big deal here, just as it is in the States. And Indigenous people have put up a really heroic struggle and continue to do so in face of police and army and equipment from these big companies and so forth. So what the federal government was in a jam because they're a corporate government. They not only do they represent these pipeline companies, they bought the pipeline, and so the position of Indigenous people was pretty clear. They don't want these pipelines. So what is the government going to do? Well, they want to appear to be a great friend of Indigenous people. They want a new relationship, blah, blah, blah. So what they tried to do was create a secondary leadership. And they said that they consulted with Indigenous bands, which are largely set up by the federal government. They're not the Indigenous leadership picked by the people. And some of these bands were convinced that if they could get a share of the, of the profits from these pipelines, that they would give the green light to it. So then the federal government took the position, well, who knows what Indigenous people want? They're so confused. Who knows? Some say yes, some say no. It's impossible to know. So we're just going to do what we think is best for them and for the country. So, this is a typical old story. It just underlines the fact that these are capitalist governments. They're corporate governments. Indigenous people are sitting on resources that these corporations want, and the governments in Canada are prepared to use force in order to get it. So, self-determination for Indigenous people here in Canada, I don't think so. We fight for that, but I sure don't have it. And again, look at the Mi'kmaq, the fishery. These people they have every right. Indigenous fishers have every right to fish. This is in the treaties, it's in the law, the government has, the courts have ruled. So where is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to protect their right to fish? Well, they're just, AWOL. But who is out there attacking those fishers, including burning their boats, firing live ammunition? Well, it's the commercial fishery. And the big villains in the piece, by the way, are these big fish corporations, billion-dollar corporations who figure the Indigenous fishery is impinging on their profits. And unfortunately, they have manipulated small fishers, the white fishers, the same as they did on the West Coast some years ago. And it was Homer Stevens, an Indigenous member of our party, who also he was an organizer and at one point president of the Fish and Allied Workers Union on the West Coast, who was able to bring these forces together and to recognize who's the real enemy here. It's these big canning companies, these big corporations, which are trying to divide working people. And there is racism, which they are exploiting to use against Indigenous people. So the government's role here is really, really stinky. They have a lot to answer for, as they have historically.
Thank you very much, Liz. While we are waiting for questions, and as I understand it, none have come in so far, Raymond, would you like to give us your last song as we wait to see if any questions come in?
Yes, I could go with the last song. It's called the Miigwech song, the thank you song. It's also from a Ojibwe traditional song. I got the wrong drum. So it's Miigwech Negamo. It goes like that. It's also an old song. Way hey ya, way hey ya, hey ya. Way hey ya, way hey ya, hey ya. Way hey ya, way hey ya, hey ya. Way ya, way ho hey, hey hey yo. Way hey ya, way hey ya, hey ya. Way hey ya, way oh hey hey yo. Way hey ya, ho, hey, 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 yeah, way, oh, hey, 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 no. Way, hey, yeah, way, hey, yeah, hey, way, hey, yeah, way, ho, hey, 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 way, hey, yeah, way, oh, hey, 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 way, hey, yeah, way, hey, way, hey, yeah, way, hey, way, hey, way, oh, hey, hey, way, hey, way, oh, hey, hey, oh, way, hey, way, oh, hey, hey, oh. Yeah, let me go and try.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we do have a question here for the panelists, and this is open to all panelists because it's addressed to everyone. So how does the panel feel about the possibility of successfully using the electoral system to advance the socialist cause in Canada? Let me go first to, well, let's go in order of our speakers. We'll go with William, Brad, Yaroslava, and then Liz.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm really not that familiar with Canadian voting policies and procedures. I mean, I don't think. I'm sorry. So I really can't speak too much of any type of expertise to that. So I think I'll pass it. I will say that all I can talk to is the broken system in the U.S., of course, and their electoral system and their electoral college, and how it absolutely does not represent the values and the wants of the people, because it doesn't represent the popular decision-making process. It's a group of people who are bought and paid for by lobbyists and who control the elections, and that's the way it goes. As far as Canada is concerned, I mean, quite honestly, I don't have any faith in any democratic voting system of any kind, really. So, I mean, that's really how I can speak to that. That's all I can speak to that.
Thank you, Bill. Brad?
So I think you know, a lot of what Bill says about the American system is true for the one here. I think that, you know, the best chance for socialism that exists on these territories always comes from within ourselves and within our movements. I think grassroots movements of people are always the best way to go. And I think, frankly, that it's from within Indigenous nations, it's from within our peoples that we can see an alternative to the capitalist system. You know, our struggles, you know, on the front lines has been those that have challenged the force of capitalism, and it's the moments where we've engaged in, you know, recognition, where you know, that sometimes gets undermined by the capitalist system itself. I think of, you know, my own folks in Newfoundland, the Mi'kmaq struggle there for recognition, where, you know, it was largely co-opted by the state. Folks were pushed to give up their land claims and so forth, just for basic recognition under capitalism. And so I think the best way forward for any socialist struggle of any flavor or dynamic is to look to Indigenous struggle, to look to the abilities of our peoples and our cosmologies and worldviews that are the original and rooted causes and ideals that make up this place, and really find ways to advance those struggles through whatever means possible.
Thank you, Brad. Yaroslava, perhaps your experience in the Chilean situation would be enlightening here.
I actually think that I would agree with the speakers, though, in terms of the structure of the Canadian state. I think the thing that we need to remember, because I think there's a difference in terms of, for example, talking about different kinds of states as, for example, republics and colonies. That essentially Canada is still a colony of Great Britain in the most technical sense of the term. And so, at least in terms of the Canadian context, we like the Canadian state, like the head of state is still to this day the English crown, and within the structures of that system, then like you still have to, while there is a possibility of having progressive governments and being able to push through progressive legislation in those governments, it doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, through socialist means that someone can, like, for example, come up through the electoral system and not be disbanded by the crown itself. And while there's no precedent of that happening here in Canada, in Australia, for example, not even a socialist government, a progressive government that was also very capitalist, was ousted in 1975 through the representative of the Queen in Australia, who is the Governor General. And so if we look at the structure of the Canadian state, while we can maybe, there might be some hopes in terms of passing progressive legislation, I don't know if we can actually achieve something that is politically, like, within the, like, that is actually socialist within electoral means, because of the structure of the Canadian state and because of the structure of Canadian politics locally. That's my analysis of that in comparison to other places. Chile attempted to do that in 1973 because of broader geopolitical forces that were at play. That didn't end up going so well. And there are lots of different divisions, and I'm not going to go into that right now in terms of the different perspectives of whether or not it was something feasible or not. That's not really my place as Mapuche. I feel like that's still a very separate process, even though it is interrelated to our own. But in terms of the Canadian question, that is, I have my serious doubts, as other folks have mentioned. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Yaroslava. Over to you, Liz.
Well, that's a very interesting question and interesting comments from other speakers. I guess as a communist, we tend to start from we always start from a class perspective. What is the lineup of the working class and the capitalist class? What's the relative weight of forces on each side? I think that is actually what determines the outcome of elections. So long as working people are divided, and so long as the capitalist class is pretty united, they are going to run the show. That doesn't mean that reforms can't be achieved. For example, the pressure currently that is on the Canadian government to actually do something about the issue of climate change, for example, or the issue of a national child care program, or pharmacare. It's possible to get reforms out of this government, but are we on the verge of a revolution in Canada? I don't think so. Having said that, I think I mentioned earlier that the anti-capitalist sentiment is certainly growing, as is interest in socialism. So it isn't only anti-capitalist, it's also people are saying, well, let's have a look at socialism. And that means that people are starting to look a lot more closely at how they want to live, and if not capitalism, then what? And I think that, you get in elections essentially what you achieve in the struggle before the election takes place. So I think all the other speakers have indicated they think that, what the people's struggles in the labor movement, the indigenous movement, people's movements are really where the action is. And that certainly is the decisive factor. You get on election day what you've achieved beforehand. So having said that, is it possible that people in Canada, working people in Canada, would get so angry and so upset that they would decide that they want to not only throw the government out, but throw the system out? Yes, I think so. If I didn't think so, I wouldn't be a communist. I'm an optimist. But I think those conditions we're starting to see quite a change in Canada. And, so it's pretty obvious why the climate crisis is a matter of an urgent matter of concern to everybody. The pandemic, which the government and the capitalist governments have handled so badly everywhere, is also resulted or triggered an economic crisis with very serious results. We have people who have now been living for most of the year on $500 a week, which they're going to ask to be paying taxes on, by the way, right after Christmas. So where they're going to get that, I don't know. The big concession from the government in the throne speech was to not to cut it by 20%, but to make it $500. So we are looking at permanent long-term unemployment for at least 4 million people, if not more, and their families. And if this isn't something to get people riled up about, well, there are a lot of things that are moving on to the front burner. Now, the other question is, and I guess this comes up from the point Yaroslava was making about what happened in Chile, is, is it possible to have a peaceful transition? Well, it all depends on what the strength of the capitalist state is. If you look at the United States, it seems to me that it's a pretty serious situation, the U.S. elections, and it looks like the Republican Party is prepared to take armed men into the streets. They're already doing it. So, and we're not talking about a revolution here. We're talking about actually, I think, what is looking more like a coup. But so in Canada, if the majority of people decide it's time to move towards a socialist society, as they have done, for example, in the Bolivarian Revolution or in Venezuela, there will be a reaction from the capitalists for sure, as there was in Chile. So people need to be prepared for that. And if you look at Bolivia, I think what the people are doing is absolutely magnificent. The struggle that they're putting up against armed fascists to preserve their movement towards socialism and the mass party, and Evo Morales as their illegally removed president. Well, this is what you have to do at some point if you want to change the system. And if they aren't going to go peacefully, and they probably won't, and we have to be, if Canadians prepared to make that change, they'll do it. The same as people in Bolivia, same as people in Venezuela, Cuba, Vietnam, other places. Nobody said it was going to be easy, but the alternative is looking pretty grim, especially when we look at the United States. And so keep up the struggle, William. We're counting on you.
Thank you very much. Those are very wise words and deeply felt convictions from all of our wonderful speakers here tonight. So I am getting a heads up from our technical expert, Jay Watts, the central organizer for the Communist Party, who is saying there are no further questions. So I'm going to turn this over to William Milner to say a few words before we wrap up. Off to you, William.
Thanks, Larry. I first of all wanted to thank all the speakers for coming out again. I'm just supposed to do a final appeal for donations, and I wanted to bring it back to what Larry said at the beginning. This is for the Org Fund, which we use to pay all the wonderful people who run stuff for us and keep the organization going. So whatever you can pay always helps.
Thank you very much. This has been a bit of an experiment. We normally do this in person, and we usually do it at the Happy Goat Coffee Shop on Laurel, and we have a chance to, break bread with each other and connect. And this year we had to look for an alternate approach. I do want to thank all of the people who tuned in. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. I know there were at least 28 people at one point. I don't know if they're all still with us. But I want to thank all of them for attending. I want to thank each and every one of our guest speakers for sharing your insights and your knowledge, your thoughtfulness, and your perspectives. It's so important to hear from you and learn from you how we will struggle going forward. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Raymond for sharing with us some wonderful First Nations songs. And I want to underline how important the cultural struggle is in the anti-colonial struggle. It can't be underestimated. And I know there are many, many, many allies of First Nations that have stepped up and come out. The massive demonstrations across the country and here in Ottawa in support of the Wet'suwet'en and the various blockades. I mean, this was very inspirational, and there were many, many, many allies there. So as Brad and others have pointed out, focusing in on these First Nation struggles, making this front and center in our anti-colonial past and present efforts is important. And really, I would say that most of the First Nation approach is in fact a socialist form of existence. And so there's a direct link between First Nation struggle and socialism. And so that's something we need to remember, we need to build on. So I think that's it. I want to thank everyone for their participation. If by any chance you can make a donation, we would greatly appreciate that. But just being here is also significant, and we appreciate that greatly. So with that, I would like to say good night and good struggles to all of you in all of your individual efforts and in all of your collective efforts. Thank you so much. There's a bunch of memos coming in on the chat. So let me see what they're saying here. Lots of comments coming in here. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Larry. And
Good night.
everyone. Nice to hear everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.